Hello and welcome. If you're here, I hope that means you're ready to build some DIY guitar pedals or other hobby electronics. So before we get into all the nitty-gritty details on how to solder, let's first watch the whole process in a quick overview. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is bend the leads on this resistor to fit it onto the circuit board. Some components might already be ready to go. And now we're going to place it into the holes wherever it needs to go. We will pull the legs through to get it nice and flush. This is just to make it aesthetically look nice, but it's not strictly necessary. Flip it over. I'm going to secure the circuit board to the table with a little bit of blue putty so it doesn't slide around. I've got these legs bent out so the resistor doesn't fall. Now I'm going to tin the tip of my iron. That means I'm going to wipe all the old solder off of it and then immediately apply new solder. And this is both going to protect the tip of the iron from oxidation. It's also going to provide a layer of molten solder that's going to more effectively transfer heat. Next, I'm going to heat up the pad and the component simultaneously. And to help do that, I'm going to first melt a little bit of solder into that joint so I've got some heat transferring more easily. And then I'm going to push solder from the other direction and let it wick up the component and across the pad. Let's do that one more time. Apply some heat, add a little bit of solder as a heat bridge, push the solder in from the other direction, and it flows across the pad and up the component. And finally, I'm going to wait for it to cool. I don't want to move it while it's cooling. That'll result in a bad cold solder joint. Then I will clip the leads off of that. And I'm clipping the lead, not the solder joint itself. And that'll leave a little mountain of solder right there. Now that you've seen what soldering looks like in real time, let's go through it step by step and talk in greater detail about what we're doing. But first, I want to draw your attention to this How to Solder booklet. It's available both as a PDF for free or this printed, very affordable booklet. I think it's really important you go through this in addition to watching this video. So this video is going to show you the mechanics of how to solder, and you can see what it looks like, and we can talk about why we're doing what we're doing. But this booklet's going to give you a lot more background information that we're just not going to cover here. So for example, it's going to give you a glossary. So if you hear any words that you don't understand, you haven't heard before, check the glossary. It's probably in there. A lot of common soldering terms. It's going to walk you through the different tools. You know, the very few tools that you absolutely must have and the optional ones that could make your life easier, but you probably don't need. And it'll help you decide whether or not you should invest in those. It'll discuss inexpensive versus expensive irons and help you figure out which soldering iron you should purchase. It'll go through in great detail in this table here, what are the differences between the budget iron and the expensive iron, and is that trade-off acceptable? Super short version is, it's usually a better idea to get the inexpensive iron unless you know for sure you're going to do a lot of soldering. It'll help you choose tips for your iron. It'll help you choose the type of solder you're going to use, leaded versus lead-free, and what the considerations there. Again, super short version, use leaded solder, and then just wash your hands when you're done. It'll talk to you about how to protect your eyes, your lungs, and your table. Super short version, wear eye protection and use a fan to blow the fumes out of your face. But we'll talk in greater detail in the book about carbon filters and things like that. It'll also cover flux, different types of flux, what it is, what it's useful for, and the types and how to clean it. It'll talk about how to pick your soldering temperature. And then it'll go through a bunch of troubleshooting steps as well. Now in this video, we're going to cover probably the most common problem, which is misplacing a component. But this booklet will cover other types of problems or even misplacing other components besides the resistors that we're going to use here. So check it out. Okay, so let's get ready to solder. So the first thing I want to do is tin the tip of my iron. And what tinning means is I'm going to cover the tip of the iron with a thin layer of molten solder that's going to do two things. It's going to protect that tip from oxidation, so it's going to keep the oxygen from bonding to the tip there and inhibiting the heat. And two, it's going to form a molten layer that's going to make it a lot easier for the heat to transfer from the tip of the iron to whatever you're trying to heat up, the solder pad or your component. So what I'll do here is, first thing I'm going to do is turn on my iron. And while the iron's heating up, I'm going to get some solder ready. And what I'm going to do is, as it reaches the right temperature, I'm going to immediately put a bunch of solder on the tip, especially if it's a brand new tip. And so as the temperature of the iron gets hot enough, you'll see the solder will start to melt on there. And what I'm going to do, because I'm going to set the soldering iron down for a few minutes, is I'm going to go ahead and just add some extra blobs of solder to really make sure it's good and protected. set that aside. Now, when your iron's already at the right temperature and you're using it, what you want to do is every time you pick up the iron, wipe it down, because what you'll see is that oxygen is going to bond to the metal on the tip of that and start to turn it brown and get it kind of nasty, and it won't effectively transfer heat as well. So we're going to pick it up, wipe all of that off, and then apply new solder, and then go solder the joint. And then optionally wipe it off again, put new solder on it, and then set your iron down. So we're going to be just habitually wiping the tip, adding solder, doing what we want to do, wiping the tip, adding solder, setting it down. So now that we have our iron pretty well protected with a blob of solder, let's get our sponges ready. So for the sponges, we have a couple of options. And again, we talk about these in detail in the book, but one option, usually the most common and my favorite, is a cellulose sponge like this. You get it kind of damp. You don't want it to be dripping wet, but just a little bit damp. So pour a little bit of water on it, squeeze it, make sure there's no excess water coming off, and that's pretty good. And I like this little curve cut in mine because it makes a good place to pull the iron back and forth on. And this is just a regular kitchen sponge. You can also use these brass sponges here, and the nice thing about these is they won't thermally shock your tip, but they often leave little balls of solder on there, so they're not my favorite. So if you've got an iron full of solder like this and it's starting to turn brown, you're getting ready to use it, what you want to do is just come down here to your sponge, wipe it off really good, flip it on both sides, wipe, 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 get all of that off, and then immediately put another coat of solder on there. And that's ready to use. So I'm going to add a little bit extra because I'm going to set my tip down. I'm going to set the iron aside for a moment and get ready to start practicing our first joints. Now in order to follow along, you're going to need something to solder. So if you came here from the beginner's pedal kit, you can use this soldering practice kit. Alternatively, if you want to buy this, it's pretty inexpensive. It's available at our shop. I'll put the link down below. But if you don't want to buy this kit, another option is you can use any sort of prototyping boards. So we have perf boards with individual solder pads, or you have strip boards or vero boards with strips of copper with holes in them. Either of these will work, and then you'll need something to solder to these, like resistors or capacitors or something. But let's go ahead and take a look at what comes in the soldering practice kit. So in your kit, you're going to get this practice circuit board, and this will have a bunch of holes up here for you to practice soldering resistors to it. And then when you're done practicing, you can build a flashlight project in this area down here. And for that flashlight project, we're going to need 3 resistors. So let's go ahead and tear 3 resistors off this strip, just tear right through this paper, and set those aside for our flashlight project. Along with that, we'll set aside our battery holder, our LEDs, and our buttons. We'll look at those later, but those will be for our flashlight project. And then these remaining resistors, after we tore off the 3, are going to be used for practicing. And then finally, the other thing you have in your kit here is this blue putty. This is really useful for sticking your circuit board to the table or holding components into place. So what I'm going to do is take my circuit board, grab the resistors. I'm going to pull one resistor off this band. I'm just going to yank the legs out of that paper. If there's any little residue left over, just pull that off. And now what I'm going to do is bend this into sort of a U shape, like that. Then I'm going to go ahead and stick it anywhere on the circuit board. It doesn't really matter because this is just for practice. I'm going to stick the 2 legs through the holes and push it through. Now, if you don't have needle nose pliers, that's okay. It may not look quite as tidy, but you can get it done. You just sort of shove it in there. But if you do have needle nose pliers like this, it makes it a lot easier to just pull these leads through. Now, once you have them through, what you want to do is bend them to hold the resistor in place. So let me pull this one through a little bit farther and then pull it to hold it in place. Now that resistor is good and stuck there. And what we can do is flip it over and we're going to solder this side. I'm going to get my blue putty here to hold my circuit board in place. I'm going to go ahead and wipe off my tip a little bit, make sure it's got plenty of solder on it. Put on my safety glasses. Now, when I go to solder, it's important to remember we're bonding these 2 metals together. So it's important that both the lead from the resistor and the pad are heated up sufficiently. And then this solder, this metal is going to melt, and it's not just going to melt to one or the other, it's going to really bond to both of them and create a good, solid electrical connection. So in order for that to work, I need to press my soldering iron up against both the pad and the lead, and then push in solder from the other side. Then take it away, And voila, we're done. Now, oftentimes, especially if your iron isn't tinned very well, or even if it is, sometimes you'll have trouble transferring heat to both the pad and the component. So what I usually do is I'll put that tip in there and immediately put a little bit of solder between those three parts, between the iron's tip, the resistor's lead, and the pad. And what that's going to do is create a heat bridge. So let's get a little bit of molten solder in there to act as a heat bridge, give it a moment to heat up, come in from the other side, and push in some solder. And if everything went well, you should have two nice dome-shaped, shiny solder joints like this. And if you look in our booklet, you'll see illustrations of both good and bad solder joints and what might have gone wrong if they don't look correct. But if yours don't look right yet, don't worry about that. This is our very first resistor we've soldered. Let's do it a bunch of times and then start to figure out, is it coming together or are your joints misshapen, and then figure out why. All right, so now that we have the first one done, let's go ahead and clip the extra leads. So what I want to do is hold this so it doesn't go flying and create a safety hazard, and I'm going to clip it right above the solder joint. So I'm clipping the lead, not the joint itself. So you don't want to clip it flush with the circuit board and make it nice and flat. You'll still have that little mountain of a solder joint after you clip it. And now I'm going to save this clipping so I can use this for additional practice in these holes here. So set that aside. Let's go ahead and grab the other one, clip it on the lead, not the solder joint, and let's move on and do another resistor. All right, so I'm going to take another resistor, bend the legs at about 90 degrees so you have a nice U shape. Go ahead and put it in the circuit board anywhere you like. And push it through. Grab those leads, pull them through, bend them off to the side to hold it in place, bend it off to the side to hold it in place, and let's set it down and solder those joints. I'm going to go ahead and wipe off my tip again, apply some fresh solder, and if it's not taken very well, I'm going to go ahead and wipe it again, apply some fresh solder. And on that note, if you tin your tip and you find that the solder is balling up on the tip and just falling off and it's not wicking its way onto the tip, that means you need to keep cleaning it. Clean it repeatedly until it will take the solder. And if eventually it never does, it's time to replace the tip. And there's more details about that in the booklet. All right, so we've got a nice tin tip. And let's come back in here. I'm going to apply solder to one side, create a nice little solder bridge between the pad and the component, let it heat up for just a moment, push the solder in from the other side, and then pull it away. Now, when I first started pushing that solder just there, I felt resistance. My left hand pushing the solder like this sort of stuttered a little bit. It didn't smoothly flow in. So that's another aspect of soldering. It's not just about what you see, it's about what you feel. And you can actually do most of your soldering by feel. So I'll put that on there and I'll just start to push it, and it's flowing nice and smooth, so that one went really well. But for example, if I'm working with especially bigger components, so for example, if I'm soldering a foot switch for a guitar pedal, or if I'm soldering a jack with the big lugs on it, that takes a lot more heat before that solder will start to flow. So if you start to heat it up and then you start to push the solder, you'll feel resistance. And when you feel that resistance, stop, continue to heat it. If you find that after about 5 seconds or so, you're still not getting a good flow of solder, then you don't have a good heat bridge. That means your iron's not transferring enough heat to that component. So pull it back, let it cool down, reassess, clean your iron, apply new solder to it, take a look at it, make sure you've got a good wet coating over it, and then reapply heat, hold for a few seconds, start pushing that solder into it, and see if it starts flowing smoothly. Okay, so I'm going to clip off these leads. All right, so go ahead and practice soldering a bunch of resistors and the cutoffs. Do it as many times as you need to until you feel very comfortable with it, until you feel like it's going well. If it still doesn't seem like it's going well, go ahead and I'll put a link down below. Go ahead and visit our forum and post a picture of your board. Tell us what you're experiencing, and we'll help you figure out what to do next. But chances are it's just going to require more practice to feel what you need to feel and to see what you need to see. So look again at our booklet on page 1 and 2, and we have really simple to follow illustrations that are actually easier to see than you're seeing on this video. Easy to see of exactly where you're putting the tip, where you're pushing the solder. It's got time checks even, so you can see approximately how long should have passed. You know, you saw that in real time here, but I'm admittedly doing it a little quicker than you might. So if it takes you 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds instead of 1 or 2 seconds, that's okay. Now anything over 5 seconds, then you're probably pushing it too far. But yeah, go ahead and look through the more details here. Keep practicing and until you feel comfortable. And once you feel comfortable, let's move on and build the flashlight project. Okay, so I've got my flashlight parts gathered up here. I've got my 3 resistors, I've got my 3 buttons, and my 3 LEDs. So generally for most projects, regardless of what they are, when we're placing components, we try to place them from lowest to highest. It's not a hard and fast rule, it doesn't really matter, but if you do it that way from lowest to highest, you'll find it's the easiest way when you flip it over that you don't have tall components blocking your shorter ones from sitting flush. So we're going to start with our nice short resistors here. And what I'll do is, again, just like we did during practice, bend it at a 90-degree angles. But this time, instead of putting it at an arbitrary place up here in the practice zone, I'm going to put it down here in one of my R1, R2, R3 resistor spots. So we'll stick this one into R1. And pull the leads through, bend them out. Make sure it's sitting nice and flat. And even if it's not sitting flat, that's okay. There's no wrong way to do this. As long as your electrical connections are good, you know, that's just a cosmetic issue. Let's go here and add our putty, push our circuit board down to hold it. I'm going to re-tin my tip again. Give it a good wipe, get it nice and clean, put some solder on there. And maybe a little too much solder, there we go. And, oh, I felt a lot of resistance there. I knew there was a bad heat bridge, so I backed up. Let me let it cool off for a second. Let's try again. Put my tip on there, push down pretty firmly, get a nice heat bridge, push in some more solder, and that should be pretty good. Let's go ahead and do this one. Okay, those look good. So what I'm going to do is clip these leads off. And so I've been doing one component at a time so far, but you really don't have to. So this time, let's put in 2 resistors. Let's go wild. So I'm going to go ahead and place R2, and I'm going to place R3. All right, they're sticking up like that. And again, if yours looks like that and you solder it in place, people are going to say it's sloppy, but it'll work. So do what you want to do. But I'm going to grab my needle nose here, pull them through, bend them out. Pull the lead through, bend it out, pull the lead through, bend it out. Now one downside to doing multiple joints at a time is you see the legs are kind of all in the way. So you have to be a little more mindful of working your iron into those spaces. So I'm going to go ahead and do this first one up here. And I don't have a good heat bridge. So I'm going to wipe off my soldering iron tip again. I'm going to re-tin it. I'm going to go back in, push a little bit of solder between the lead, the pad, and the iron tip to start with to get a heat bridge. And then press in from the other side, and this time that worked much better. So let's do it again over here, give ourselves a little heat bridge, push it in. A little bit of a heat bridge, push in some more solder. And we missed one up here, so let's go ahead and press that into the joint. Put in some solder. Now I'm going to pull this away, and you won't be able to see it on the camera here, but I'm going to bring it close to my eyes, and I'm going to take a close look at those solder joints and see, do they look like nice little mountain shapes, and are they shiny? And you'll notice one thing I've been doing all along here, and I guess I haven't talked about it yet, is once I solder the joint, I don't let it move. Don't let the lead move inside that hole. If your parts are moving around while you're soldering them, you're going to get what's called a cold joint, which means you'll have solder around them and they'll be mechanically looking like they're held together, but inside they won't be electrically connected as well as they should be, or maybe not at all. Because if you've got movement in that joint while it's cooling, that's going to spoil the bond between the metals. Okay, so I've got my resistors 1, 2, and 3 done. Now let's go ahead and put our little buttons on. Now you'll notice the buttons, their legs are not symmetrical. You'll see they are fat on one side and skinnier on the other. And so that'll correspond to these holes on the circuit board where you see they're more oval rather than round. So I'll go ahead and push that button into one of these button slots. And if they don't want to stay, you know, if they want to fall out when you tip it over, actually that one's staying pretty well. But if they want to fall out when you tip it over, you've got two options. One option is you can take these legs and you can, with your fingers or other tool, bend them out a little bit or bend them in a little bit. And that'll just give them a little bit of gripping power on the circuit board. The other way is put that button in there and then just take a piece of blue putty here and stick it over there to hold it in place. Okay, now with that button held in place, let's go ahead and solder it. So my iron's been sitting here for a while. The tip is looking pretty nasty. So I'm gonna go ahead and wipe it off, wipe both sides, and apply some new solder. That looks pretty good. So now let's come back and solder the button pads. And these are a different shape and a different size than the resistors, but all the same steps are going to apply. Now I can see I put a little too much solder on that one. I can see it's sort of bubbled up. Now, when you have a bubbled up solder joint that looks kind of like a dome rather than a concave mountain, oftentimes that can be a sign of a bad solder joint. It could mean that it hasn't properly bonded to the component underneath there. So what I did, when I see that bubbled up joint, you know, if I really, really wanted it to look perfect, I could come in and try to remove some of that solder with a solder wick or a desoldering pump. Those are tools for removing solder from the board. But I don't think that's really necessary. But if I do think that it might be a bad solder joint, I'm going to come in there and do what's called reflowing. So reflowing is just really simple. It just means I'm going to add heat to that joint, and I'm going to press my iron in there and make sure it's heating both the pad and the component, and then pull it off. So all I did there is just make sure that that solder remelted, bonded to those metals, and then hopefully it's a better, more secure joint. So I'm going to re-tin my tip, and that's a common theme. You should be tinning your tip quite often. Now let's go ahead and do the second joint. So I'm going to push this in there, make sure it's touching the pad and the button's leg, put a little bit of solder near that to form a heat bridge, and then pull it away. Now that one looks a little domed too, so I'm actually going to take a closer look. And no, I think that's fine. So for a moment there I was worried that both of those joints were looking bad, but they actually look pretty good. It's hard to see from up here. Usually I lean a little bit closer. But let's go ahead and do these last two joints now. So I'm going to push that in there, get a nice heat bridge, push some more solder in, add a heat bridge, push some more solder in. And that time you'll see I did the heat bridge a little different. And this is actually how I usually do it. What I'll do is as I'm putting that iron down towards the joint, I'll just quickly tap a little bit of extra solder to that tip while I press it in there. So I'll try to do that again in real time to show you. So let's add another button to the circuit board. Hold it in place with some blue putty. Get it down here where you can see it. Now, I'm going to bring my soldering tip in, and while I do that, I'm going to immediately touch a little bit of solder in there to get a good heat bridge and come in from the other side, and that's good. So let's do this 8 more times. Okay, and one more button to go. Go ahead and hold that button in place, flip it over. Okay, with all 4 buttons in place, let's go ahead and move on to the LEDs. So the LEDs, like all diodes, so they're light emitting diodes, like all diodes, they have a polarity. You know, there's a certain direction through which current flows. So they have a positive and a negative side. The positive side, or the anode, is the longer leg. The shorter leg is our cathode, or the negative side. Now let's say you're reusing an old LED that you've cut already, and you don't have a longer and shorter leg. Another way to tell is if you look closely at the body of it, you'll see one side of it is a little bit flatter, and that's going to be your negative side of your cathode. So I'm going to go ahead and take my longer leg, the positive side, I'm going to put it through the part of the circuit board that shows the plus. And you'll see our negative side is also indicated by the flat body of the LED. So I'll go ahead and put that in there, flip it over, and just like we did with the resistors, I'm going to bend these legs outward. And that'll hold our diode in place. Now, one thing to note with diodes is they're a little more sensitive to heat than other components. So if you've been so far taking, 3, 4, 5 or more seconds to do a solder joint, I'd recommend practicing a little bit more before you start with these diodes, because if you start soldering the diodes for 5 seconds or so, you might burn them out. So heat bridge, push that solder in, and done. Heat bridge, push the solder in, done. I'm going to give these a moment to cool. I don't want to grab them right away because I don't want it to move while it's cooling, but it's cool now, so let's grab it and clip these leads off. And let's flip it over and do the other two. So I'll put the longer leg into the plus side, turn it around, bend these leads out. Oh, look at my awesome camera work. There we go. Put the plus side in there, flip it over, bend the legs out. And let's go ahead and get these soldered. And my tip now has kind of a big blob of solder on there that's getting in the way. So what I'm going to do is clean it off, get all that excess off, and tin it again. Make sure I don't have too much. Let's go in there and finish that last joint. Now I'm going to pull it up, take a closer look. Looks good, so I'm going to bend the leads back up so it makes it easier to clip them. And go ahead and clip all 4 of these off. Now finally we're going to solder this battery connector. So the battery connector has 2 little pins. If you are missing one of these pins and you don't have this little fork, look inside the bag that this came in. That fork is probably in that bag. Sometimes these fall out. So what I'll do is I will line this up with the outline on the circuit board. Now this definitely will not want to stay in place, so I'm going to use my blue putty to hold it in place. And let's flip it over and solder those 2 pins for the battery. All right, that joint didn't feel good. I felt a lot of resistance. I mean, it looks okay, but I didn't like the way it feels. So I'm going to go ahead and reheat that again. Push a little more solder in there, make sure there's some fresh flux in the joint. And I think we're good to go. All right, now let's get that battery in there and bask in the glorious light that we created. So I'm going to take this coin cell battery, a CR2032, or a CR2025 should fit as well. We're going to take the plus side and face it up. That's also like the flat side, the flat smooth side. So to put it in, I'm just going to wedge it up against that side and then click it down. And similarly, to get it out, this little thing that just clicked, I'm going to pull that back and it should pop right out. So let's click that in there and let's push the buttons and see what happens. Oh, white light, red light, green light, excellent. Now if your lights don't work, don't worry, that's totally okay. That's what we're here for. We're here to practice. So on the off chance you've still got problems, it's probably just one of 2 things. It's either you've got a bad solder joint, in which case, flip it over, go back and reflow each of those joints. Heat up the component, heat up the pad, make sure the solder flows over it. If you're not sure, maybe add a little bit more solder if you think there's not enough in there. Or 2, the other problem might be a misplaced component. And so this one, most of our parts are symmetrical. They're pretty straightforward. It's hard to get them mixed up. So most likely if you have a misplaced component, it's going to be one of these LEDs that are backwards. So look really closely at the body of the LED and make sure the flat side is lined up with the flat side on the circuit board. If you're still having problems though, again, don't worry. Come to the forum, let us know. We'll try to figure out what's going on for you. In worst case scenario, you can get another one of these for a few bucks. We'll ship it to you. You can try again. You know, this is a really low stakes project, and the point is to get comfortable with your soldering iron, get comfortable with the feel of how the solder flows, to get comfortable with watching that solder wick up against the component, watch it flow across the pad, and to learn to visually recognize when you've got a good solder joint. Now let's talk about what do we do if we place a component in the wrong spot. Like for example, let's say you're building a guitar pedal and you take R1 and you put it in the R2 spot. Well, we need to pull that resistor out, and then we need to replace it with the correct one. So we're going to look at how we do that here. And there's a lot of ways to do this. The How to Solder booklet, if you take a look at that, shows you a few different options, and it shows you how to do it in a variety of scenarios. You know, maybe instead of a resistor, you have a capacitor with legs that are really close together. Well, the method we're going to do here might not work for that, so take a look at the booklet for a more comprehensive overview. But what we're going to do here is going to cover 80% of your cases. So basically what we want to do is heat up the joints that are holding that component in place, and then pull one of the legs out. And then heat up the other joint and pull the other leg out. And we might have to do this a few times and sort of teeter-totter the component out of it. So to make that really easy, what I've done is I've taken my circuit board and I've laid it on its side. Now you can have somebody help you and hold it for you, or you can use whatever you happen to have around the house. I'm going to use my bench vise here just because I happen to have it and it's pretty stable. Now I'm going to come in here and heat up one of the legs, and I'm going to use this pry tool here to yank at it and pull the resistor away. Alternatively, I could use these needle nose pliers and try to pull it out. You could use your fingers if you're careful, but you run the risk of burning your fingers, so that's generally not advisable. Okay, so what I'm going to do is first tin my tip. I want to make sure we're able to get a sufficient amount of heat into that joint to remelt that solder. I'm going to take this pointy tool here and just wedge it in there and get ready to start prying at that resistor. And then I'm going to apply heat to the other side, wait for that solder to melt, and then give it a bit of a tug here. And there, that popped right out. So you can see now this resistor is hanging by just one of the legs. So to pull it the rest of the way out, I'm going to use my needle nose pliers. And give that a grip there. Heat up the other side and give it a yank. Now we have a problem. So as you can see, those pads are full of solder. Now there's a couple of options we can do here. One thing we can do is use a special tool like a solder sucker. A solder sucker is a little hand pump that you can press up against the board, heat up the other side, and then release the plunger to suck the solder out of the hole. That's a really effective method. So a solder sucker is going to look something like this. You can press the plunger to charge it, heat up one side of the solder pad, push this on the other side, and then release it to suck that solder out. These plastic tipped ones are okay. They get the job done. They're very, very inexpensive. But if you can find one with these rubber tips, those will give you a much better seal, but these do cost a little bit more. Now that said, you don't need a solder sucker, and in fact most of the time you can get by very easily without it. So what we're going to do instead is we are simply going to heat up those solder joints and then push the resistor in through the molten solder. So we're not going to remove it, just push it through the existing solder. And then we'll add a little bit more solder to get some flux in the joint and make sure it's a good solid connection. So a trick is, let's go ahead and bend the leads like we always do to get a nice U shape. But this time what we're going to do is clip them short. And I'm going to do a special trick here. I'm going to leave one lead pretty short. That's probably good. And then the other one, I'm going to make it a wee bit longer. And the reason I want to do that is I'm going to push this longer leg in, and this shorter leg, we don't want it bumping up against the circuit board and getting in the way. So we're going to push the longer leg in, heat up the other side, push the shorter one in. And we might have to do that a few times to rock it back and forth. So let's see how that works. I'm going to use my needle nose pliers to protect my fingers from heat, but again, if you're careful, you can get by without it. So what I'm going to do is look at one side of the board. I'm going to touch my iron to that to heat up the solder. I'm going to quickly look at the other side, get the resistor lined up, and try to push it through. And there it goes. So it's not all the way in yet, but at least it's connected for now, and we'll come back and push it in farther after we get the other side pushed in. So now I'm going to heat up the other side. Look at the other side of the board, grab the leg, and push it in the hole. Pull the heat off, let it cool for a moment, and now that's soldered into place. There's a good chance that those are cold joints though, because I'm moving things around as I'm doing this. So what I'm going to do is just continue to push that in just to get this resistor seated a little bit better. I'm going to heat up that side, push it in. Going to heat up this side and push it in. So what I'm going to do now is come back, and because all the flux has burnt out of that joint, and the flux is really important for ensuring that we get rid of all the oxidation and have a good solid connection, I'm going to retin my tip, come in here, heat up that joint, and I'm going to apply some new fresh solder. It's going to be a little bit bulbous. There's a little too much solder on that joint. But the good, and I just pulled some of it off with my tip of my iron. But the good thing is now I know it's a nice stable solid connection because it's got fresh solder with fresh flux in it. All right, I think that's pretty good. So we can clip these leads. I'll clip the longer lead, and voila, there we go. So that might take a little bit of practice. It might take you a few tries to get it, but it's really not that hard. I think the important thing is, as you're trying to work that component back into the spot, if it's taking too long to push it into place and you're struggling, stop, let it cool, take a break, and then come back. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or any problems or whatever, again, visit our forum. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube, you could comment below, but we're not going to be checking that as often, so it's better just to reach out directly. Love to hear what you think, and most of all, I would love to see what you guys build after this. If you build any pedals, you build any synth projects, whatever you build, come over to the forum, post pictures of it, show us what you're doing, because that's why we do this. I'm extremely excited to get more people involved in this hobby, and I hope this helps pave the way. So, great. Have a great day.